this peach Bellini candle. Aesthetics matter, smells matter. It's worth it. Okay. Crap. Don't like that. Mike's doing that thing. Oh, crap. I got too many windows open again. How do I have 3 monitors and I still screw this up? Okay, I'm sorry to the person that sat there for 4 minutes and I did nothing. Oh, that was probably just me checking it out. That's all right. Oh, crap. Where did it go? Shoot. Okay. Let's get it. It's freaking, I'm going to.
And about a year ago, I started a server called Rise to Power, and we made a lot of episodes on there. And I thought it'd be really cool to put all of the episodes together, and make a.
Okay, how am I sounding on that? Oh crap! I needed to do them at the same time. I'm really stupid.
The first thing I did was run away from that giant mob of people until eventually I found a really nice place to settle down.
I'm gonna check now how the audio is.
I made this small little shack and tried my hardest to survive in the wild. I got a gun in Minecraft. Also, it's nighttime, and it's very scary out here in my little shack. I'm terrified. I'm gonna go inside now so I don't die. After a while, living alone just wasn't fun, and I wanted to join other people. Luckily, there were things happening in other parts of the world.
I muted the wrong one. Oh, that's fine. No one's watching.
There are currently 5 nations,
I'm testing how it
meaning
is
I had
now,
5
and then I'm gonna
potential
mute this.
homes. My first option was this. That's
okay,
how you
that'll
pronounce
work. I'm muting it. All right, Cleveland.
Hello, everybody. I'm Captain Nate, and I enjoy the entire episodes together, and make a full movie. So enjoy the entire Rise to Power movie, starting now.
Cleveland.
The first thing I did was run away from that giant mob of people until eventually I found a really nice place.
This is a Minecraft civilization video, so they're basically going to simulate a civilization, and I'm going to be pretending. Well, not pretending. It is real. This is real. This is real now. This is real life, and I'm going to be treating these Minecraft players as they are real people interacting in this way within the rules of the society, just in Minecraft and not real life. So, yeah, I've had this idea for a while. We're going to try it out. Let's see.
Place to settle down. I made this small little shack and tried my hardest to survive in the wild. I got a gun in Minecraft. Also, it's nighttime, and it's very scary out here in my little shack. I'm terrified. I'm gonna go inside now so I don't die. After a while, living alone just wasn't fun, and I wanted to join other people. Luckily, there were things happening in other parts of the world. There are currently 5 nations, meaning
Homo sapiens are social creatures. You got to find other people. Now there's 5 nations. That's pretty sweet.
I had 5 potential homes. My first option was this nation called Nercaria. When I got there, they were planning a meeting with another nation called Chekorsia. I think that's how you pronounce it.
That's not going to go well. I can already tell. Probably got some 14-year-old little Marxists in that one. Let's see, though. Maybe I spoke too soon.
What if you guys? What if you guys both give each other gifts and then you move on and you become friends?
They stole from us. We have nothing.
Oh.
You killed Ryan.
Sorry, I didn't know the context. Oh, I didn't know it was that serious, to be honest. I didn't know there was murder involved. I'm just kind of here, to be honest. I live in the woods.
I mean, that's a reasonable.
Whoa.
So, like right here, they got a conflict, right? And this is something that happens in a lot of earlier societies that like don't have specific ways to deal with that. There is something that is pretty common in clan-based societies, which is a lot of them. Like in America, North America, we think about it as like the freaking, what are they called? Hatfields and McCoys, clans, Scots Irish, that type of thing. Yeah.
Apparently, someone killed a guy, and then one nation stole from the other, and now they're both very upset. And after I failed to ease the tension, I decided to leave.
I mean, you guys stole our enchanting table, and you killed our cows.
Because we have our own.
This gets escalated.
You know, there's a possibility someone came.
He's escaping. He's escaping. He's escaping.
What do you mean escaping?
He's escaping.
What do you mean escaping?
He's escaping.
I'm just running. No, I just don't want to be. I'm getting shot at. Oh my god. Oh my god. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. I ran all the way back home, and then just as I got home, Nercaria declares war, Seeing this happen made me realize that I didn't want to live in any of these nations, so that narrowed down my options to 3 nations. Oh wait, the war is over. Jacorsia surrendered with no real fighting taking place. Then Nerkaria said, listen, come back, give us a second.
So I mean, that's what happens if, you know, somebody doesn't want a war. If you're in a situation in a country or a civilization where the war, like you've been declared war on, but you know there's just no chance that you're going to be able to fight it, then you're probably going to give up. Or, you know, you might fight for better terms. It depends on the situation, depends on the culture of the place. But yeah, what this is what'll happen. And then, but over time, you can just, you know, lose your whole country. Let's see.
Second chance and pretend this whole war thing never happened.
I don't buy it.
So I went back to Nerkaria. Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
You see that spyglass in front of you?
I Nate's spyglass.
Do you not?
Oh. This meeting went way better, and they were really nice to me.
Our nation was founded by myself and Escario.
That guy over there really likes spyglasses.
Yeah. We have
Staring me down.
Yeah, that's the king. The king takes a shining to you, Nate. We also, I think we're one of the funner nations.
I mean, hey, every time I've been
Something-
here, some fun has happened, so.
Yeah, we like to have fun. We don't like to all work and no play, because all work and no play makes us sad. Well, cool seeing you.
All right.
Hope you consider our nation. And,
I definitely will,
see you
and
soon,
I'll
hopefully.
if I choose this nation, I'll come back.
Alright.
Bye.
Later, Nate.
Bye. While I was in Nerkaria, a new nation formed in the southern hemisphere called Shoto. This nation was located on an island surrounded by water, and I didn't know much about it. So what could go wrong?
So this is the thing that I've been meaning to do something on. Island nations in the real world, they tend to get really weird. And this is true in like a localized area, like the Haida that lived and still do live on some of the islands off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. They were similar but different to the other Native Americans around them. This is true of the Native Americans who lived on Fisher's Island, which is off the coast of New England in the Long Island Sound. It's true of a lot of different places, and this has to do with a number of different factors, and it differs based on how large the island is as well. I mean, even the British Isles, England and Ireland are. Sorry, I didn't mean to say British Isles when referring to Ireland, my Irish friends. But it's a thing. It's a thing, and it's less of a thing when it's a larger island. But like when it's a smaller island, limited resources. Limited resources, limited space. It kind of necessitates some different. It necessitates different cultural responses to the different problems that they have, and then as such, it creates a specific culture, a very specific and unique culture, because they're responding to different needs than the people near them geographically, which creates different outcomes. Oops. Okay.
Ow, what the? I'm leaving.
No, don't
No, I'm
leave.
leaving. I join here
Who's
and
this?
you accuse me of teleporting. And oh no.
He shows up. They're mean. It's like North Sentinel Island, man. Get away from them. You're not going to make a lot of friends that way.
Oh, now I'm definitely leaving.
Why are you leaving,
He
Nate?
looks like he's
Huh?
gonna put me in some kind of bank fraud.
Why are you leaving, Nate?
I don't want to get into that.
Wait,
I have a
wait.
good credit score. I don't want to ruin it. I'm just
You don't.
going for a stroll. Don't follow me.
I'm not following you, don't worry.
I feel like you are actually.
I'm just getting some fresh air over this way.
Yeah.
Me too.
You know, in my
Oh,
defense.
no.
Wait, what
Oh,
did you do?
He
again? What did
punched
you do?
It's-
I forgot.
Don't you run. You stay here.
What?
Stay.
Yes, now
Hi.
I can talk.
I don't like this. This is.
Do you want to
scary.
know what we based our nation on?
I
My
I don't
favorite
think I have a
country in the
choice.
world, North Korea.
Yep, I got kidnapped in Shoto, and after they robbed me and took all of my things, I was feeling pretty hopeless.
Suche.
Luckily for me, Nerkaria was aware of what was going on and sent someone out to come rescue me.
Hello.
Hello.
See, and this is like the power that somebody can wield internationally. It's like if somebody has multiple passports, a lot of sway, and they're in another nation, they're stuck somewhere else. Like if you're an American and you're stuck somewhere, they're going to evacuate the embassy. They're going to try to evacuate all the Americans. But they will evacuate more important Americans first. And the way that they decide this is there's a number of different factors, and I know this because I trained for embassy evacuation in the Marine Corps, but it's a thing. When I say trained for embassy evacuation, I'm not saying like this was a whole like SEAL level operation. It's like in the case that would be needed, I would have been one of the guys as part of the thing. That was one of the unit I was with. Gosh, guys, I'm sorry, I'm sick. I'm sounding all bad. Cleveland. Yeah. Embassy evacuation. Like this guy has international sway. So he's stuck on this hostile island in this powerful nation, Nicaria. They're going to show up and they're going to save him because he has that status.
Hey,
You're not allowed here.
Yeah, why isn't he here?
Because I said so.
Is he in your
I don't
nation?
really care. Who? Blocks?
I'm just gonna go this way. I'm going
Are you
this way.
leaving?
No. I'm not leaving. We're not.
Nate, get back here.
I'm not leaving.
Nate. Nate, get back here.
I'm not leaving. I'm going to the beach.
Hey, he's
Oh my
part
god!
of us.
Oh my god! He shot you. Oh.
Go now. Come on.
Dude, that's where you are.
Chop. Maybe we'll meet again sometime.
What? Nate,
Come on, Nate.
I built a whole house for him.
He brought me back to Nicaria, and once I got there, I officially joined their nation. Now I know what you're probably wondering. What's going
You'd probably join the nation too if they saved you. I would. Nice guys.
on with those other nations? Well, there's now 7 nations, and the largest one is the Red Knights. The Red Knights currently have 2 colonies and have the largest population on the server. They recently had a meeting with Nicaria, and the 2 nations are in good relations. The northernmost nation is the Great North. I do not know much about them at the moment. Same with Daytopia and Archipelagon. One of the Nicaria members decided that he was no longer a proud member of Nicaria, and this made the rest of Nicaria very upset. If you don't like the nation, I guess we'll just have to kick you out. Nope. What? No, you can't do that. Why? Because if you do, we're going to be very upset for really no reason at all. And maybe even invade you. Hey, that's not...
So this is maybe even invade you. This is like creating a casus belli, right? A reason for war. So the other nation, this one, the Red Knights here, they just want a reason to go to war. So they're going to go to war. That's just what's going to happen. And they'll just create a proper reason. And then not only will they create a proper reason, they'll then create a reason in their culture why that is an acceptable reason. And this is how Rome fought defensive wars for their entire existence, but just kept expanding because they just found a reason to consider it defense. And this is how wars can get started at any time for any reason, essentially. It really has to do with the underlying material factors, the underlying belief systems and power dynamic between different countries, different cultures.
Not nice. And so, out of fear of being invaded, Nicaria... Wait, where'd they go? After Nicaria was threatened to be invaded, all the members went into hiding, pretty much abandoning the country. We all lived in a cave for a while.
Do you want armor?
No.
Do you want a house? Make a house.
No.
I
Last
will,
time I
one
gave
day.
Nate armor, he lost it within 5 minutes.
That is true. I gave him full netherite, and man's died.
We should
It's either-
decide.
North has a very small population and is looking for...
Talking about
Yeah.
that.
We should.
If only there was a dying nation with a very small population looking for someone to lead it. Oh, look.
See, that's funny because this is something that really, really does happen in different cultures. There will be a situation where, countries will merge together or they'll work together. Specific example is, I think the Cherokee or some other culture became the 6th nation of the Haudenosaunee. They needed shelter, and the Haudenosaunee were low on people, and it helped them both out for them to unify themselves. And this has happened successfully and unsuccessfully in other cases as well, like in the like Czechoslovakia, between the Czechs and the Slovakians, they existed together for a long time, and then they eventually tore each other apart, but it was amicable.
The Great North has a very small population and is looking for someone to lead it. If I take over the Great North, I promise that if you guys get into any wars, we will help you. Oh, don't worry. We won't get into any wars. Look at me. I am the leader now. Okay. This is the Great North. I I just became one of the leaders today, so not much has happened here because I just got here, but I do have a lot of plans for this place. And the first plan was to raise the population, because right now, the Great North has the smallest population on the server. Hey, want to join the Red Knights? No. Who said that? He wants to join the Great North. And after convincing some people to join the Great North instead of the Red Knights, I had another idea. The Red Knights were divided into 3 sections, the mainland and then 2 colonies. Currently, the Red Knights have the largest population, but if I could convince one of their colonies to leave and join the Great North, we could potentially have the biggest population. Hey Ostia, what if you left the Red Knights and joined the Great North? You know, that doesn't sound too bad. Hey, I declare war on you. Well, if you declare war on him, I declare war on you. Yeah, well, if you declare war on him, I declare war on you. Why? Apparently, someone killed a guy, and now Wildwood and the Red Knights are at war with Northumbria and Chekorsha. Yes, it's pronounced Chekorsha. I got it wrong last video. Deal with
These guys just want to fight each other.
it. One Wildwood member and the Red Knights made the long journey to get to Northumbria. But just as they got to Northumbria, Chekorsha and Northumbria snuck around and went to the Red Knights' capital. When the Knights realized that no one was in Northumbria, they turned around and went back to their land, only to be ambushed.
Yeah, they're all there, they're all there. Got another one.
After a long battle, the Red Knights had to surrender, ending the war. The Red Knights end up losing both of their colonies. Corinto becomes independent, and Ostia is now under the control of Northumbria. Wildwood then has a meeting with the Great North to try and rebuild their reputation and create new alliances. Yeah, I think an alliance would be good. One thing I would want to see is the ability for your nation and my nation to be able to go to each other's lands, be friendly and peaceful.
I
wanna
don't like
make
this one. I
sure you
quit.
don't have-
Crap, I should just change it to a different thing. Hold up. I'm gonna throw up another I'm gonna do this video, but I gotta make a dumb thumbnail for it real quick. I think I can change it midstream. So if you just joins, which I appreciate, just bear with me for a second. I'm gonna react to a WHATIFALTHIST video. As long as I can change this midstream. Come on, create my file, mother. That's not it. From Mia Khalifa up there. Oh my gosh, that's not it either. What happened? Oh. guess this is what I do now. All right, give me 1 minute. Just gonna use the bathroom again. I'm drinking a lot of juice. Oh, hey man, that's funny. Yo, you were, I forget your real name, but you were the bartender at Margaritaville in Tulsa, man. What's up? How you doing? Are you at work right now? Sorry, I don't expect much. I'm sick on COVID, and I'm trying out reaction content because I'm too dumb right now. Well, I'm too sick right now to make anything original.
Memory, Britain was the largest country in the world and ran India, one of the largest and most populous nations on the planet. This tiny island ruled the world within the lifespans of people alive today. For young people like myself, it's easy to forget how big and how recent colonialism was. How Europe colonized almost the entire planet and dominated the globe for 500 years. At the time, colonial empires were seen by the Europeans as civilizing forces that they were doing out of goodwill to the colonized.
Damn, bro, that is...
My namesake Rudyard Kipling
rough.
called it the white man's burden. However, today our society has made a 180-degree turn on this issue.
Love this. Turtle Island here, that's like the indigenous name for North America or the Americas or the whole world, depending on your interpretation.
The West now treats colonialism as the worst thing to have ever happened, and now constantly apologize and flagellate itself over it. The problem with both of these worldviews is that they're too extreme. This video is about if colonialism was a positive or a negative to the world in the course of history. This video is going to go through the history of colonialism to see if the pros outweighed the cons.
So, I mean, immediately, no matter what we do here, there's a specific, like, when you decide whether something's good or bad, it's a socially constructed, it's a cultural, it's a, it's Cleveland. When you decide whether something's good or bad, you have to create the criteria for whether something's good or bad. And like, obviously in a culture like the Aztecs, or really any culture from 200 plus years ago, the values we have today wouldn't be anywhere close to it. They were all much more violent, even just 200 years ago. And that's not even saying anywhere outside of Europe. Even Europe, the Americas, very violent. But yeah, I assume he'll be specific about his criteria.
Through this process, we'll tackle many sacred cows and myths that our society is terrified of looking at honestly. For God, gold, and glory to the new world and beyond. I have a special integration this time. My friend Philippe Fabry, who does the same kind of stuff as I do in France, has recently translated several of his books into English. His theories have been a big influence in my own, where he's developed theories for the cycles of history, and he's also a fan of WHATIFALTHIST. Some of those include he's spoken about the parallels, stages of empire, of continental wars, like video topic, really well name. Sure, Imperial you'll find any in English YouTube.
Cleveland.
To get started, let me use myself as an example for the effects of colonialism. I'm named Rudyard William Lynch, and in the current cultural context, I'm part of the political right. Thus, people might believe that I'm an unalloyed supporter of colonialism. However, the truth, like absolutely everything else, is much, much more complicated. My mom's side's mostly English, the nation that had the biggest colonial empire in history, with colonies on every continent on Earth. My family immigrated to America in the 1600s, clearing the land and fighting the native tribes. They're a prime example of people who benefited from colonialism. However, my dad's side's Irish. We ignore this today, but numerically far more Asians or Europeans were colonized than Native Americans or Africans. The Irish were a colony of the English, where the English killed off the entire native Irish ruling class, attempted genocide, evacuated the Irish from a quarter of their island, replacing it with settlers, forbade the native Irish from voting, owning property, or obtaining an education in their native country. The Irish were brutally oppressed serfs in their own country.
800 years of oppression. Don't forget it.
On both sides of my family are people who benefited and who took a lot of losses from colonialism. I can already hear people typing, "You're white, it's not the same." This brings up the next point about this debate. The effects of colonialism are heavily politicized today, and talking about it honestly is impossible without causing mass offense and political crying and emotion.
Recency bias.
The truth gets blurred when politics are in play. The reason people say white people were never colonized in the same way as other ethnicities and people of color is since white people are successful today, even though that
I think there's also a factor of there being a smaller degree of difference and a less obvious modern difference. I mean, people don't really realize that I don't think people really realize that even up to 70 years ago, it was very different between Irish people, Italian people, and like German, French, English people. You know, the idea of what is white is a lot more malleable than modern Americans are willing to admit, and the idea of race over time changes very quickly. But still, it's these are less obvious differences, and they were mostly stamped out in the mid 20th century. And World War II had a lot to do with it. There's lots written about how World War II was a time of unity between at the very least different types of whites that prior to World War II were not considered the same group.
That was absolutely not true at the time. The way the British treated Ireland was comparable, if not worse, than Kenya or India. People don't really care about what actually happened in colonialism. They just want to use it as fodder for their political views today. My favorite era of history is the Middle Ages, and people often ask me, what was life like in the Middle Ages? Or what was the tax rate in the Middle Ages? And the thing I'll have to say is, you know you're describing a 1,000-year period that covered multiple continents. And it's the same with colonialism, where the period of European colonialism, which we're going to discuss here,
this often happens. The colonialism of like the 16th and 17th century gets then lumped in with like the 19th century, and really, you know, this stuff changed over time. But yeah, I should stop pausing it so much.
Happened over 500 years with so many nations and on every continent on Earth. And so just be aware that there is a lot of diversity in the period we're talking about, and that we'll have to make some generalizations here. In this video, we'll be looking at Europe's colonies from 1500 until roughly 1950, since that's what most people mean when they talk about colonialism. One of the points people rarely understand is that in a lot of ways, this is an arbitrary metric. Nations have had colonies since the dawn of time. Sumer colonized Akkad, China colonized Vietnam, or the Romans Britain. Every society since the dawn of time everywhere in the world has colonized other peoples. People often talk at the European colonial empires like they're some kind of special evil. Well, the reality was at the exact same time, the Turks, Mughals, Songhai, and more had their own colonial empires.
I think part of this is just what we know about history. And it's very American-centric, Western-centric, but often people just don't know about the Ottoman Empire. They don't know about the Ottoman slave trade because they don't know anything about it.
For a lot of the period we're talking about, the Asian empires were much, much larger than those in Europe. I mean, the Europeans have been colonizing each other for thousands of years, with the Roman Empire being the easiest example. The biggest problem in our philosophy is that we compare society to utopia rather than other historic societies that are comparable. People often say capitalism makes poverty or greed causes war. The reality is that poverty, war, and oppression are normal across the world in history and in every single society since the dawn of time, whether the pharaohs, capitalism, communism, or feudalism. Rather than saying what systems cause poverty, war, and oppression, we should be really grateful to those which bring us wealth, peace, and freedom. This is a view that originally stemmed.
Gosh, but these things have to be defined. You have to define what freedom means. You have to define what wealth means. You have to define the values of a society. And unfortunately, a lot of death and murder and you know, mass sexual assault is the result of these well-meaning, in theory, justifications.
Stems from Gnosticism. Gnosticism believes that the world is an evil conspiracy, and a few enlightened ones whose souls are freed from the evils of the world have discovered that. They have the hidden truth and are meant to fight against the sinfulness of a world run by Satan. This is a view which gradually evolved into communism, Nazism, and the modern left, who view the world as an evil, oppressive conspiracy by a few elites, while the anointed and enlightened who know how to make a better world should team up to destroy the world's evil. This is a worldview which holds the average baseline view of reality as a moral evil rather than just how the world works. It doesn't judge it against how the real world has been shown to work, but rather how they want it to work. In the modern left today, there's no way to distinguish what people want to believe and what's actually the truth. In this video, we will be comparing European colonialism against other societies in history rather than a perfect abstract. Through this perspective, European colonialism is a very normal event over history, just on a larger scale given the Europeans gained technological and sociological edges over their opponents. Look at Ali Bai or Emperor Tiger Star's map videos to see how much borders change over history.
I really recommend people do that. Like, watch some of these videos, just pay attention to them, see some things that you don't recognize, like watch the geography, how it changes, recognize patterns. It's a really important part of if you want a wider understanding of history and of social studies in general. I tend to, you know, I started as a history buff, but obviously I mostly do anthropology now. And that's because history as a discipline gets concentrated on so much, but everything around it is so important to understanding history as well. And it sometimes gets lumped in, but history that includes geography is not the same as looking at some real intentional geographical study. You should go to these different disciplines if you want to be a well-rounded historical learner. I really believe that. And that's, you know, I got so much out of when I was in college, like a very simple geography class. It was a very easy class, but I got so much out of it because it was stuff that I hadn't concentrated on in that discipline before.
Pulling from Matthew White's book Atrocities, which chronicles the 100 bloodiest events in history and is the most respected source on that topic, what you see is that European colonialism was pretty bloody, but it wasn't abnormally so over the course of history. There were some really nasty colonial events. These include the British famines in India, which killed 30 million people, in which there was no parallel either before or after British colonization. Leopold's conquest of the Congo had 8 million deaths, truly making it one of the most brutal events in all of history, since that was a little bit less than half of the Congo's population. Then the entire European colonization of the New World killed around 15 million people, almost all of whom were concentrated during the Spanish colonization of Mexico or Peru. Finally,
it's hard to, these numbers like are absolute numbers, and most of world history happened when human population was a lot lower. There's kind of been a hockey stick of population over the last 300, but especially 200 years, and I mean 500 more broadly. But famines in British India, that's 19th century. Conquest of the Americas starts in 16th century, but those numbers are massive estimates. I don't think that many, well, millions died from being overworked, but most of them died from disease, which was just like not intentional by the Europeans. I'm not defending the conquistadors. I digress. Let's go, Cleveland. But yeah, these are based on having larger numbers into the future. I think by larger numbers of absolute population.
The Atlantic slave trade had a similar death toll around 15 million. These are horrible numbers, and I don't want to discount that the people who lived through these, it was a horrifying tragedy, but there's nothing particularly abnormal about them. The Muslim slave trade, unlike the European, killed around 20 million people. The Muslims had their own empires with genocides, such as the Armenians or Jews, or the brutal invasion of India. 8 out of the 10 bloodiest wars in history were fought in China, and the Japanese have also been brutal colonizers, killing 20 million. The medieval Mongols killed staggering numbers of people, approaching 80 million. The great irony is that for the last few decades, the biggest critics of colonialism have been Marxists, but they score so much worse than colonialism. Mao killed 40 million people, Stalin 20 million, and other communists over 20 million. Marxists criticizing colonialism for being bloodthirsty is the pot calling the kettle black. However, another point here is the Europeans have killed far, far more of each other than people of color. Europeans have been killing millions in the 30 Years' War, Napoleonic 100 Years World Wars, and more. And people criticize the Europeans' treatment of people of color, which on average was worse than that of Europeans. Europeans have committed genocide against each other, as most obviously seen with the Holocaust, forced them onto reservations or kicked them off their land, as we've seen with the Irish and Acadians, locked each other in concentration camps with the Boers, and anything else you can think of. We have unrealistic views about this today, given we think that war is impossible, and after World War II, we decided just to freeze borders, and wars of expansion were always evil. However, this is a trauma reaction to how horrible the world wars were that can't account for reality. You can't freeze the world map. In fact, what sounds reasonable is really a very conservative stance, since it holds that the current ruling powers should dominate the world forever. Imagine if we just froze borders and empires in any other year of history. World War I, even for how awful it was necessary.
And this is unfortunately like what ends up happening, and why war is inevitable to a certain extent. And I think it can be mitigated, but the changing dynamics of identity and power and shifting situations just mean that eventually, I gotta remember to change these. Eventually, there's going to be a conflict, with two different groups of people trying to both have the same thing, and that thing is mutually exclusive, and that creates a major problem, because that has to be reconciled. And that means if these two things that these two people groups want, they are mutually exclusive, they can't both have them, then over time, if there's enough friction in that area, then they're going to turn to violence. And that's something we've seen just the last few days, as I'm recording this, in Israel and Palestine.
Social institutions had stratified.
And unfortunately, it's just young men like this, probably a teenager right here, that suffer, as well as other innocent people.
And fossilized, and the world needed violence and a crash to reset to a more healthy place. Imagine if Austro-Hungary was still a country today, or if Britain owned all of East Africa. Due to this, war is the norm over history, and we must see war again in the future. Azar Gott's masterful book, War and Human Civilization, which I think is one of the best ever written, talks about how war is necessary to human society, and covers the history of war and how war influences human culture. We tend not to ask the question, why do we wage war? However, the reality is that war is normal, peace is not. Peace happens once war is no longer economical, since one power is so great that it doesn't make sense for any other players, such as the Pax Romana, Britannica, or Americana. For all of human history before World War II, there was a principle named the right of conquest, which is that a conqueror deserves the land he conquers from the local people. This sounds like a brutal principle, and it is, but for a second, let's not.
And this is the way that for most of human history, this right of conquest, this is how it was decided. It's the monopoly on violence. And it's honestly still what's used today. It's just a euphemism. For example, in the United States, whoever controls the territory is who is basically able to control the territory, whoever is allowed to commit violence in that area. And for us, it's the police, it's the cops, because like you might not think of it this way, because it's a socially constructed idea that the police are allowed to detain and arrest you even if they're doing something wrong, you're supposed to follow their orders and then work it out in court, right? That's what you're supposed to do. So they are allowed to commit violence because arresting you is committing violence. There being laws, socially constructed laws. I mean, regardless of if you break those laws, those are the laws of man, right? They're created by man. And when you break those laws, then you will be arrested, detained, whatever. And that's true in the society. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have that, but I am saying that is still violence. And it's violence that we accept, but it's still violence.
View it as a statement of how the world should be, but how it really exists in fact. The reality is, whether or not we like it, the right of conquest is how the world works. Every country in the world got its land from conquering it from someone else. The reason Russia or France have the borders they do is because of war. The state exists predominantly to defend or manage a certain geographic region, and if it fails at that, it stops being a real state and someone else takes over. We act like this isn't the way the world is today, but the only reason East Germany and North Korea existed at all was right of conquest by the Russians. The reason Bangladesh or America are independent is because their militaries took it. The reason Texas or California are part of America, not Mexico, is right of conquest. The problem we have today is that we live in a historical aberration, the Pax Americana, in which the Americans have agreed to block any attempts to conquer territory by other players. I see people act as if we're just...
It's kind of like, when you're you're playing a basketball game and then you're up and you're like, okay, the game ends right now. Who's ever winning is up. Like Michael Scott literally did this in The Office. It's, you created the rules and you took advantage of the rules when you were in charge and you were making the rules. And then you just decide, okay, the game's over now. Now everyone's got what they got. Oh, we got all this stuff and you guys don't have as much. Well, whatever. We're still in charge. But eventually what happens is it changes. Like the situation changes in a more real way, in the sense that different countries, they then they get more powerful for whatever reason. They get stronger, and then they're able to, in a more real way, affect the rules. Because just because the rules exist, just because the rules are written somewhere, doesn't mean that other countries have to follow them. If China doesn't want to follow the Geneva Convention and they're powerful enough that they can just do whatever they want, then they don't have to. It's kind of, the United States hasn't, and other NATO countries haven't really been following international law, arguably in a bunch of different situations. But who's going to stop them? Nobody else can yet. But eventually someone will, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Too enlightened to have empires today. The reality, though, is that today the US acts exactly like an empire, with armies, bases, and navies. Meanwhile, countries like Russia and China are openly imperialistic, wanting to expand their territory. Hell, we're even seeing a war in Niger now, where France maintains what really amounts to an empire in West Africa. Peter Zeihan talks a lot about this point today, but since the Americans protect global trade, you don't need a strong military to survive as a country. However, this is a historical aberration. In previous eras, if you wanted to trade your goods, you needed a strong navy. You needed a military to protect your borders, and your neighbors were constantly scheming to conquer you.
And navies were much more important in the past than they are today. They're still very important, but they used to be used a lot more than they do. It's still huge, but it used to be even more huge. And that's what happens over time. Different resources become more important. So like oil became important. And then countries that had oil became important overnight because they had a large amount of oil. And then sometimes what that can mean is, okay, you used to not be worth it for us to colonize, but now that oil is important, we got oil, now we're going to take you over. And that sucks. So it can be a curse. And this is true of the natural resources curse is a thing that's been studied in anthropology and other social science for a long time.
When you conquered your neighbors, you didn't treat them well, since you knew and remembered a time when they conquered you and did the same. This is just how the world's been for forever before the Pax Americana. This wasn't really viewed as good or bad, just the way the world worked. I often see comedians or members of the chattering classes today make snarky remarks. Isn't it so weird the Europeans would invade other people's land to take their stuff? The short answer is no, since standards were much lower. When people talk about slavery, they don't keep in mind that these were societies where most free people lived in abject poverty. And so there was a legitimate intellectual argument the slaves lived better lives than the free poor.
There's also the Overton window shifts over time. So when humankind was a lot more savage, just all of humankind was, and savage meaning like more violent, essentially. Then slavery was accepted pretty much everywhere. There were certain places that got rid of it, but it usually had more to do with an economic reasoning than anything else. So countries that didn't have slavery often just had serfdom, which is a form of slavery. It's a form of indenture. It's a form of being non-free. Many cases of it mean that you have no rights at all, and your lord can just kill you with little to no recourse in a lot of different situations. So it's not, it's not really that simple as having slaves or not. It's just we have a culturally informed way of understanding what even being a slave means. And then this was the practice forever, for thousands of years, as long as anyone can remember. So then you get into the modern era and it changes to the point where, number one, the economic situation has changed, and coming with that, people's lives get better, and then the difference between their lives is more pronounced. And I think it's natural for people to then be like, hold on, we're doing what to people? That's not okay. Even if like they viewed at the time, people like Lincoln did view black people as inferior to them, but many of them, even though they viewed them as inferior, they still didn't think that black people deserved to be treated in that poor of a way. Yeah, so that's where you get these abolition movements. And then today we have lives that are so incredibly good. It's just so hard for us to even imagine being in a situation like that, and we don't really get it. We can say we get it, we can try to get it, but we don't get it because we didn't live that life. And you can try to put yourself in those shoes, you can try your best, but we don't even know. Yeah.
Since they were economically more secure, and they'd be poor either way. To be clear, I don't support slavery. In
That's
many
good.
videos, I've said it's one of the worst things you can do to a society. However, the fact that most people over history did means that this is a more complicated and muddy issue than we give it credit for. In this scarce world, the choice for colonialism was if you would help your country's poor at the expense of another country's. The idea of colonizing the New World was a ray of hope for millions of desperately poor people. The precedent that we're trying to judge the rest of history from exists in only a handful of countries for 80 years, and we can't hold on to it, so we're judging the entire human experience from a very weird sliver of history. We're not better people today, we're just richer and more complacent. We tolerate loads of horrible stuff when it's not in our immediate view, whether the close to slave labor conditions that make our clothes, mine the ships for our phones, factory farming, and our society tolerates cancel culture or modern witch burnings over very minor things. In our society, just go online and you'll see that we're incredibly cruel to each other. If you look at Twitter, it's impossible to believe the average person has advanced beyond witch burnings to real tolerance and humility. I remember right when the Ukraine war started, which, by the way, I do support America's role in, there was a poll where a majority of left-leaning Americans wanted to have a war with Russia to support Ukraine. Then I thought to myself, you guys criticize the rest of history for being bloodthirsty, but you want to start a war that would kill millions of people on just a whim like this for a country that explicitly chose to not be our ally and put itself under our protection. Again, we're not more moral, we're just in a position where we're safe enough to pretend to be. The fact of the Ukraine war...
I would just want to hear that again.
Moral, we're just going to be our ally and put itself under our protection. Again, we're not more moral, we're just in a position where we're safe enough to pretend to be.
We're not more moral, we're just safe enough to be in a position to pretend to be. I think that's what he said. Wow, that is a good line. Great line. Cleveland.
The fact of the Ukraine war and China preparing to invade Taiwan also shows that we're not beyond war today. We keep on calling people in the 19th century racist, but remember, Britain ended the Atlantic slave trade and then made it so that other countries also couldn't practice it.
And just so we're clear, yes, Britain ended the Atlantic slave trade, but they did that because of an economic situation. And I'm not saying that to like get rid of how good it is to get rid of slavery, but the fact is that they ended slavery because they were using serfdom in India, which is basically slavery. It's just a different form of indenture. And they were doing it indirectly, but they were making a lot of money from it. So them banning slavery actually helped the British Empire. It helped the British Empire because they could then take this morally superior route, and they did, of creating casus belli, reasons for war, to invade and attack other slave states. And this didn't just mean European slave states. They used this as a reason for war, a casus belli, to destroy multiple African kingdoms that were on the west coast of Africa, because people tend to not want to talk about this, but it is very true that once the slave trade got going past the 1500s into the 17th century, the 1600s, then the slave states or the states in Africa, these kingdoms became powerful by capturing other slaves. They got more powerful. They got more followers. They became much larger, and they traded slaves with Europeans, so they were able to make a lot more money. So it was a feedback loop. It was feeding into the slave trade over time. But the important thing is once those civilizations were created, once these slave states were created, they then were destroyed by the British. And then settler colonialism happened there. So it's settler colonialism replaces slave states, and they're both pretty bad. I don't really know which one is worse. I think settler colonialism is probably a little bit better, just because people are more free. And I'm just going to address this from Craig in the comments. So serf sounds so much better than slave. So yes, so in almost all cases, serfdom is better than being a slave. You still belong to somebody. You still generally have a Cleveland, by the way. When you're a serf, and there's different levels of this, peasants and serfs are sometimes lumped in together. I generally think of serfs as being in more of an unfree state, but there's not like a clear line between them. But with serfdom, you weren't, a serf was still able to live kind of a normal life. So they were still at the whim of their lord. So you could have a lord that was really cruel and would kill random people, sexually assault women, unfortunately. Things like this were really common. But really, if a lord wanted to be successful, if they would treat the serfs well, because there are a lot of peasant revolts. These are things that happened, more common than slave revolts. And eventually what happened is, there's a bunch of different slavery over time, but as far as slavery in the Western Hemisphere goes, that slavery, in conjunction with the economic factors of capitalism, I think really turns into this thing that is much worse and treats human beings as chattel, as cattle, as objects in certain cases. Because in New England there were legal protections, and then slavery was ended in the time of the American Revolution for the North, and then I digress. But yes, being a serf, like in Connecticut, there were slaves, but you weren't allowed to separate families of slaves. So it was more similar to other forms of indenture. But in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in certain parts of the Gulf states, the South, you could sell and break up families, and there were less protections with people being harmed. And so that was a worse form. But that was, again, in conjunction with these new ideas of capitalism. That's generally where I draw the line with modern slavery. It's an interesting topic of economic factors and technology contributing to this. So I digress. Cleveland, we're going to go back to the video.
Around the world, the northern United States lost hundreds of thousands of people to end slavery in the South. Would Gen Z today really be willing to die for the things they care about? I'm going to be discussing a lot of objectively horrible things here, like the Spanish invasion of Mexico, which killed millions of people, or the African slave trade. I know the Europeans did some really bad things in colonialism, but I want to play the devil's advocate to explain for some of the reasons why they did. If we want to get into the heads of colonizers a little bit more easily, keep in mind how weird and fast globalization was. Imagine a human ship is finally able to reach another planet. The native peoples there are completely different from us, and they sacrifice their own people to the gods, practice cannibalism, and worship a god that looks like our Satan. They then attack our men the first second we land. Upon discovering this alien species, how many people on Earth would want to wipe them out in an instant before they could do anything or get more dangerous? I actually think most people on Earth would support that. Orson Scott.
So this is important here. You know, in the past, the Spanish conquistadors didn't know what they were showing up to. This isn't a world where they have the internet and they know about other cultures and cultural relativism and all these things that I talk about all the time. This is a situation where the world is much less explained. It's the late 1400s, early 1500s. Just put yourself in the shoes of a conquistador. You're living in Spain. You're not even living in Spain. You're living in Castile or Aragon or Navarre. A lot of these conquistadors were Moriscos. They were hidden Jews, which meant that they were people that some of them practiced Judaism in private because they weren't allowed to practice it publicly because of the Inquisition. But they, if they practiced it in private, it was basically a don't ask, don't tell situation. Oh, and some Muslims as well. And I think Moriscos actually refers to the Muslims. Or you might be from Navarre, you might be from the Basque country, this ancient seafaring civilization, pre-Indo-European, or you might just be Spanish. You might be from Portugal, from Leon, which is now part of Castile, or Aragon. And I mean, most of the guys were Catholic. Some of them were hidden Muslims and Jews that practiced Catholicism and Judaism and Islam kind of hidden, but like, you're Catholic, you've just completed the Reconquista, 900-year holy war against Muslim invaders who had come in like what, the 600s or 700s, and it's a religiously zealous time. You don't know what's out there. You land on shores and there's these crazy dudes with obsidian swords and their hair's all crazy and they're wearing pelts of jaguars, and you don't even know what a jaguar is. You maybe seen or heard stories of tigers in Africa, but there's a jaguar head on this guy. And they have priests that are up on these giant pyramids as big as cathedrals, but they're even higher and they're massive and made of stone. And there's dudes in these crazy headdresses just stabbing people, pulling out beating hearts, and there's blood rolling down the temple. Like, it's Satan on earth. And it really is Satan on earth, because in your worldview, Satan is real. I mean, in my worldview, Satan is real as well. But I mean, these people believed it in a different way. And a lot of people don't even believe in demons and shit today. And I do, but a lot of people don't. But yeah, it's insane. It's like the different frame of reference that we have with even people 500 years ago, but even 200, 100 years ago, is just their lives were so much different. Their information, they had so much less information, and that matters. It matters a lot. Okay.
Card's books are about this. The thing is, the situation I described is exactly what the discovery of Mexico by the Spanish felt like. The people involved didn't know if the Native Americans were even human, and there was a big debate about if they had souls. It's easy for us to say how bad racism was in retrospect, but we're not in a world anymore when you run into another culture, they practice cannibalism, human sacrifice, foot binding, and more. Imagine you're from a very religious society, and then you discover a population which does all the things you were told are evil ever since childhood. The assumption going into the African slave trade was that Africans weren't fully human. I know that worldview was partly created to enslave Africans, so it's not an excuse. But keep in mind that these were societies that didn't have the scientific tools to the same degree we have today, and so when they saw Africa's lower level of development, ascribed it to intrinsic intelligence among the Africans, rather than other factors like historical chance or geography. In a society where animals work for free, and almost all Europeans lived in poverty and worked for close to free, and where all the scientists and cultural authorities said Africans were inferior, you can see why this society thought a slave trade was acceptable. There's always multiple sides to a story, and another side to the African slave trade was that the Europeans hadn't practiced slavery for 500 years before it. And there was an assumption at the time that slavery was inherently wrong. And we know from diaries and records that the Europeans did feel a lot of guilt for practicing slavery. There's also the side that the Europeans were doing something that they knew to be objectively morally wrong. We like to whitewash these events and make them clear European versus Native wars, while the reality is that they're much more complicated and bloody. The vast majority of people who bought and sold slaves to Europeans in the African slave trade were black. 90% of the Spanish armies that attacked Mexico or Peru were native. 90% of the soldiers that fought for the British in India were Indians. Native peoples were happy to work with European colonizers to get advantage over their local rivals. An example I'll throw out is that the Huron and a lot of other tribes in the Eastern United States worked with the French, and they didn't view it as betraying their people because they were using the French to help fight against the Iroquois, another native tribe, which committed genocide against the Huron. And
this is the thing, you know, when you have different identities, right? So like we think of today, we think of identities in terms of nationality, usually most importantly, and race, right? So if in North America, you know, you're American, you're Canadian, we're Anglo speaking, but that's, you know, people don't tend to, I mean, practically they do promote that identity, but in like explicitly, not really. Your race, white, black, it's very important. It's considered very important in broader American culture. Your religion is also important. Certain religions are viewed as, you know, maybe more victims than others or more mainstream or they've done something wrong. And but you run into this a lot when larger empires, and I like to use the example of the Romans, like the Roman Empire meeting up with the Gaulish people, right? So they meet up with the Gauls, and the Gauls are split up into different chiefdoms. And because they're split up into different chiefdoms, they're not united in the same way. And their chiefdoms they have disagreements with each other, long-standing disagreements that they can't just get rid of, because in their mind, their identity, they think of themselves generally as belonging to the tribe rather than belonging to other cultures. Sorry, I was reading the comment there, Cleveland. Yeah, I'll get back to you in a second, Craig. I it's my fault. I can't not see them. Cleveland. So Vercingetorix, people like Vercingetorix, Baldica, people like Powhatan, like the Powhatan Confederacy, King Philip of the Mohican Pequot, Mohegan Pequot, I think he was. And these people, what happens is with interaction with civilizations that are of a larger carrying capacity, like the Roman Empire, the situation with the Gaulish people, these chieftain people, over time, it kind of starts to affect them, especially if they're losing battles. It becomes that they have to do something where they get rid of their differences. They put aside their differences and they unite in the face of a common enemy. But it usually requires something like that. Or you could have a situation where this just occurs naturally over time. In the case of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that was true. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had gotten together around 1350 when their tribes, the tribes and chiefdoms that made up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they decided they had been at war with each other, but their cultures were mixed enough and they were at a high enough level of complexity that it served their interest to create a larger political structure, and that made them a powerhouse in the region. Okay, back to the video.
And depopulated an 1,000-mile area from Buffalo to St. Louis. Both sides, not just the Europeans, were brutal here. People give the Tlaxcala a lot of crap for teaming up against the Aztecs, but the Aztecs were a giant empire that had killed millions of people and was trying to conquer the Tlaxcala. And then the Tlaxcala, by siding with the Spanish, gave themselves kind of the positions of being a new nobility inside the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish gave them pretty
patronage, hashtag bog beef.
Good self-governance until the fall of their empire. So it was only a betrayal from their entire racist perspective, not that of their individual people.
They did not think about race like that. They just didn't. So it doesn't make any sense to think of it like that. Their enemies were the Aztecs. They were the people who had killed their brothers and sisters and cousins and everybody for generations. The newcomers hadn't done that yet. Yes, they did end up doing that, but it was after. How were they supposed to know? The enemy you know, the enemy you don't know. Yeah, that's common advice that's come out of things like this.
As a personal example, on my mom's side, I have 5 ancestors who died fighting the Indians in the colonization of the U.S. And the native peoples of the United States, like the Iroquois or Huron, would, after capturing someone, torture them for days by ripping their skin off and then eat their hearts.
Torture was very common amongst Native Americans. Algonquins out west as well. It probably was in other places, but I just don't know specifics. But yes, Plains Indian tribes and Algonquin Native Americans, a lot of torture. And that is, this is not uncommon in people of similar political complexities across the globe, including Europe, Asia. I mean, even civilizations of higher, like state level. There was like, I mean, the Chinese put a dude in the oven at one point. They were executing people, they were torturing people, they were doing it. Everybody was doing it like it was cool, like it was the frickin' Dougie. I digress.
As a way to get their strength. And I know the Europeans genocided the natives and wiped them out, but
that was one time.
In every single frontier, the natives did things that gave the Europeans a right to hate them, even though the Europeans often did terrible things back.
That's the thing. It's like, you just concentrate on specific events rather than others. You concentrate on certain ones that fit your narrative, ones that create a victim narrative, ones that give you the right to do evil things back to someone else.
For the natives. And there are no angels in the story, and these were incredibly brutal wars. An important factor to keep in mind is that the kinds of people who would sail for months on end to dangerous places, where they would probably die to make their fortunes, tended to be very hard and sociopathic guys. This selection for sociopaths, and on top of that, the
that makes sense.
Europeans having such advanced technological abilities allowed them to get carried away. Colonialism was almost always done by small groups of aggressive men without any oversight. Colonialism was never planned by European governments. What happened instead was that companies would organize colonization and then they would tell their countries that they had a colony in blank after doing it. In a lot of cases, the governments couldn't control the process even if they wanted to. As an example, let's look to the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru, where Cortez and Pizarro just got a couple hundred buddies together, discovered those empires, and then conquered them for Spain. The Spanish government literally couldn't have done anything, since they had no idea those areas existed before they conquered them. A very apt comparison in recent history is with the digital and tech revolution.
Imagine just being a military leader and going home and being like, hey, yeah, what's up, King? I got you a whole nother empire. It's over there. We got some native allies. We put them in as the lesser nobility, and we're the greater nobility. And we're just gonna start putting our serf labor to work. They're gonna make a bunch of ships. We'll just start shipping you back gold. We're gonna take a little bit. Obviously, like, thanks, bro. I know you're gonna. I'm not gonna. They wouldn't say it like this, but we'll get our royal charter and everything, and we'll take a fair amount. And then they're rich beyond their wildest dreams. Yeah, but those same types of guys, which are the ones who would go crazy like this, a lot of them lost their money and died horrible deaths and broke because they went out and gambled it and women and gave it away and everything.
Where these computer whizzes made these massive platforms and breakthroughs that changed the world. And actually, tech VC and startup organization is very similar to the colonial companies and expeditions in the Age of Discovery. But because the government had no clue what was going on, large and massive effects, many of which were negative, occurred, like female depression and suicide rates have quadrupled, male virginity has tripled, political radicalism has skyrocketed.
Well, that's not
and
good.
In the same way the European governments couldn't keep tabs on what was going on in the colonies since it was thousands of miles away, the average US senator is 75 years old, and so he has no clue how to deal with these services. What often happened was that the centralized governments came in afterwards, tried to clean up the excesses done.
Never works, does it?
By the colonial companies and adventurers. Two easy examples are the British East India Company and with Pizarro in Peru. Pizarro, Clive, and Columbus were all put on trial by their own governments for atrocities, so it's not like the centralized governments didn't care what was going on in the colonies. The Spanish government went to great effort to try to protect the Native Americans from complete slavery, but the problem was that since the empire was so big, they just didn't have the ability to really control the oppressive conquistadors on the ground. The British government passed a law in 1763 to prevent American settlement west of the Appalachians to protect the native people. But the American settlers refused to accept this, settled it anyway, and then caused a revolution that resulted in the British losing America. This process of European governments trying to restrain their own settlers happened many times and almost always failed. I was reading a book by the journalist John Gunter, who was the most famous of the post-World War II era, and he was visiting 1950s Africa and went to Kenya, where there was a apartheid system with a very stark racial line between whites and blacks. One of the biggest sticking points is the native blacks weren't allowed to go to the colonial country clubs that the whites had. This might not sound like a big deal, but the country clubs was where the elite met and governed the society. And this might sound racist today, and it
It's like
literally
that.
fits the definition of
They do something similar today, but instead it's an island with very small women on it. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Can't say it out loud.
being racist. But when the British first colonized the region, the technological and social level between the native Africans and the British was 2,000 years. Objectively, the native peoples of Kenya had a technological level equal to Britain's before the Roman colonization, with no literacy, roads, or centralized government. When the British first colonized the region, this very split society made sense since they were on such different levels of development that no other systems could realistically work. The problem later on was that as the Africans caught up with the British, and by the 50s, there was a sizable native African educated class, the British had no plans to let the Africans in on the British's institutions. This is a major problem we'll see again and again with colonialism, that institutions that were formed when the empire was originally created gradually stop working as the society changes and the locals acclimated to European standards. As a general life rule, if you see someone doing something that makes absolutely no sense to you, try not to judge them and think, what assumptions are they starting with, and are those assumptions actually correct for the world they live in? And you find that that completely changes.
I mean, the assumptions are culturally, socially informed, so they're correct in the sense that they exist.
Your perspective on the world. There's a really good book named The Rule of Empires, which goes through a series of imperial conquests ranging from Roman Britain and Arab Spain to British Kenya or Spanish Peru. It makes a couple fascinating points. One detail is that the author always shows an example of the colonizing country being colonized themselves, like the Romans colonizing Britain and then the French colonizing Italy, and it shows that everyone gets pwned by the wheel of history at some point. However, the thesis of the book is that empires are never made in good faith, which I agree with. If you look at the conqueror's policies, they always benefit the ruling elite and the conquering ethnicity. Even at Rudyard Kipling's time, in the high imperialism of 1900, where there was a lot of rhetoric around the white man's burden and positive colonialism, the usual result of conquest was division of the native.
It's always shown in a positive light. Even today, the wars that have ended, the wars on terror and everything that have ended over the past few decades. I mean, they're not really over, are they? These places. I guess the wars with the West have ended, and they're still destabilized. They're not better than they were before. And they're still justified even today, even this year. In the last couple of years, we've justified these new wars. I mean, people just don't learn. It becomes emotional, and people make decisions based on that. And you can't blame them. We're emotional creatures.
People's land and then looting their society. It's normal for the conquered to be excluded from many privileges and rule of their own society, be treated as second-class citizens inside their own nation. India benefited from the railroads, government, science, law, military, and more that the British gave them. However, the British gave them those institutions since it made India easier to govern. This is clearly shown in how the British let 30 million Indians starve without raising a finger. Sashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire does a good way of showing how the British viewed the native Indians with contempt, and even the things the British did, like irrigating large amounts of Pakistan, were done to increase tax revenue. However, that doesn't mean the conquered don't accrue benefits from empire, which they often do to a tremendous amount. A point Dan Carlin made is that once you strip away the positives of empire, which often takes centuries to accrue, such as unity, government, technology, and trade, the great men who form empires, such as Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, and Alexander's main accomplishments in life have been the death of millions. If we throw the baby out with the bathwater, we remove modern science, medicine, technology, democracy, the Columbian Exchange.
Your terms are acceptable.
human rights, and more out the window.
Your terms are acceptable.
Colonialism is synonymous with the modern world. The non-European societies, except
That's
Japan, were
Vercingetorix, by the
completely
way.
unwilling to adapt to the modern world without force. The Chinese, Indians, and Muslims only accepted modern science after their empires burned and their failings became completely obvious. These societies would still be medieval today without colonialism as they were just 100 years ago. Africans can be very plain about how dependent their societies are upon colonialism, how the institutions they depend upon are based off European forms, how the only trains and roads that work are those who are built by the Europeans, or the only way they can communicate across their large multi-ethnic nations is through English or French. A complicated point here is that the effects of colonialism aren't just related to colonialism itself. For example, the average African was unaffected by European colonialism during colonialism. Remember, the Europeans only ruled Africa for 60 years and were normally 0.01% of the population. Thus, the effects of colonialism, such as modern technology, Christianity,
they had no time to learn to use the technology in any significant way, like the Indian subcontinent did.
A money-based market or the centralized nation only reached the normal African decades after colonialism ended. On a purely numeric basis, colonialism, or really modern technology, have saved far more lives than they've hurt. Just as an example, the spread of clean water and anti-malarial medicine, both of which brought by the Europeans, have saved hundreds of millions of lives. This is one of the paradoxes you see in history, especially with war. For example, World War I killed around 15 million people, but penicillin, which was developed as a side effect of World War I, saved hundreds of millions of lives. These are completely...
Well, if you saved hundreds of millions of lives from a war that killed 15 million people, maybe we should have a war that killed 150 million people and then see how many billions of lives we save.
Dependent upon Europe's influence on the world, given all of these inventions occurred in Europe and its diaspora. One of the other points of the book The Rule of Empires is that the pain of colonialism has much more to do with the power relationships in each colonial country rather than the morality of the people involved. When the British colonized India, they were so outnumbered, around 1,000-1, that they needed to work with the local Indians very closely to control India. When the Spanish colonized...
So this really has to do with the amount of power that the local people that are being colonized are able to put forth. So when there is, or when you have a situation where the native people are weak, they don't have a strong political structure that exists past when the Europeans showed up, and this happened in all over Mesoamerica, and that really is because the Mesoamericans were so decimated by disease. 75, 80, 90% of the population dies over a few generations. Then you have a situation where the political structure breaks down because there's nobody else following up after them. There's nobody being taught in that tradition, and the tradition goes away. So while there were empires, the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans were more like city states, but while those did exist and they were very politically complex, they weren't able to exert as much power into the future as places like India were, because they were destroyed effectively because of the mass death caused not by the wars themselves, but the diseases brought by the animals. And that meant that there was really very little resistance after a few little skirmishes, basically. And that meant that the encomienda system, which is what the Spanish had and the Portuguese had something similar, was very successful in keeping a Mesoamerican underclass.
Peru, they were terrible, killing off the entire ruling class, enslaving the native population, treating them terribly. However, they were able to do that since the technological and social difference between them was large enough that they could get away with it. The British men in India weren't more moral than the Spanish in Peru, at least by a big margin. Rather, they weren't in a situation where they could get away with being as brutal. You know this is the case because you'll see this across the same empires in the same time period. The Spanish were cruel to the Peruvians since they could, but the Spanish Empire was very kind to Belgium, since Belgium was a colony that was surrounded on all sides by opponents who could seize it, while also being very wealthy. So the Spanish couldn't afford.
And that's part of the power that they're able to exert and how they're able to get better treatment because of the situation. They have real power.
To lose Belgium. Freedom is a market value where, due to a combination of technology, numbers, unified society, military ability, and geography, certain areas can demand much better treatment than others. For this reason, differing regions got very different results from European colonialism, often by the same countries due to having very different circumstances. What we're seeing with colonialism was Europe, for a series of reasons I tackle in this video, had a staggering superiority in technology and society. The European governments didn't plan it, but enterprising groups of Europeans colonized the world. The question is, did this have to happen? And I'd say yes. There are societies that wouldn't have pushed to colonize everything they could, like the Chinese turning inwards in the 1400s, but they also didn't invent anything after that same time. However, the Europeans of our world, who created the modern world, pushing technology forward and more.
And look, creating new technology and all this stuff, you could argue that it's bad because it interacts with the technology. Like, he's talking about the technology and everything like it's an all-out good, but I don't necessarily think that's true. It's they cause social disruption. They cause, like, I mean, the cotton gin saved chattel slavery in the United States, and arguably because of that, it led to the Civil War. And these are bad things. I don't think we should be striving for unlimited technological advance. It makes sense when you're talking about penicillin, but today technological advance creates vast human suffering, even just in the form of social media. You look at something like AI, the potential for mass human suffering is even higher, and the potential to create a real situation where the haves have so much more power than the have-nots is it's huge. But yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Would have always done it. As Oswald Spengler said, the European spirit that drove to colonize the world was the same that also developed modern science, which saved millions of lives or created Mozart. There are two sides of the same coin. Modernity is colonialism. For an example of the logic of force and practicality that went together with colonialism, we'll look at the colonization of Africa at the end of the 19th century. Europeans hadn't been able to penetrate the African interior, given the local diseases were so terrible. However, with the invention of modern medicine, steamships, and the railroad, the Europeans carved up Africa in a matter of a decade. I've done a lot of research in this topic, which I've covered in this video, and the short answer for why the Europeans did this was that they just could, and the technological difference made it incredibly easy. Less than 5,000 Europeans died in the scramble for Africa. For a reference, that's about 30 seconds of the Battle of the Somme. In the 1960s, the Europeans gave up their African colonies peacefully. The reason was that the Europeans no longer had growing populations that made the colonies make sense, and on top of that, the African colonies weren't profitable. We forget this today, but Europe was losing large amounts of money holding on to Africa, which was lightly populated and poor.
And then they just pretend that they were doing it out of the kindness of their heart, but really they kind of bailed on a failing asset and they left these people out to dry after they had redrawn all these borders, brought all these people together, and it would have been much better off for everybody if they had never showed up in the first place. But, you know, the problem is that was 3 generations before. The situation was different, and the pace of technological change was so severe that it led to this.
In 1900, less than 1% of the British stock market or economy was involved in Africa. The entire British Empire was only 15% of the British stock market and foreign trade and economy, most of which was white colonies like Canada or Australia, followed by India. Colonialism happened not because it was super profitable, but simply because the Europeans could do it. As a final point, people like to say that Europe and the Industrial Revolution and modernity stemmed from colonialism, and there is literally no evidence for this and lots of evidence contrary to it. Europe was already the wealthiest and most technologically advanced place in the world by a significant margin at the end of the Middle Ages, and after colonialism, Europe's economies took off while those of the colonies collapsed, which signified that colonialism was an economic drain to Europe, but a boon to the colony.
Okay, but that's not entirely true, because they use the colonies, not Africa, because Africa, they weren't there long enough. It just didn't work in the same way. But they definitely, the technology, what was in the technology changed during this time. And a lot of these technological factors are so lagging that they're still related. And look, when European colonialism ends, that's kind of the start of like debt-based diplomacy. So they end up making a lot of money off of giving bad loans to these people, that these poor countries, and they still make a lot of money. So it's they probably just switched to a more profitable model. I don't like this idea that it's that they like, oh, they detached themselves from Africa and then they were all good at the end of decolonization. That must have meant that they were draining them. It's like, no, they switched to a more profitable model is what they did.
There's also no correlation you can run between colonies and wealth. Places with very large colonies, such as Spain or Portugal, would often fall behind economically. And from everything we see, colonialism was a representation of Europe's advancement and technological and economic superiority rather than being an effect of it. The negatives of European colonialism are common across empires in every society, but at the same time, there is no parallel to the better aspects of European colonialism. Europe giving up its colonies peacefully has no parallel in history. It's sad that the Europeans can't be proud or the Africans grateful for doing something that is insanely generous by history's standards. Although the Europeans were deeply brutal, there is no parallel over history to their generosity with their subjects. There's a book named The Barbarous Years about the British colonization of Eastern North America in the 1600s. There's an interesting anecdote that Jamestown, the first British colony in America, was run by a man who was sympathetic to the Indians. He signed a peace treaty with them and tried to do goodwill with them. The natives just used this as cover to launch an attack on Jamestown, which killed him. When we backseat drive at history, we forget what it was actually like at the time. The reason people don't trust other groups is because stuff like that's normal. Liking each other and goodwill is strange. However, this story from Jamestown is demonstrative of this European humanitarian impulse that you saw for all of colonialism, which is absent from other cultures. It goes back to the Spanish colonization of the Caribbean, which Bartolomé de las Casas wrote letters reprimanding the enslavement of the native tribes. The Spanish crown then
I'll let this go.
Went to great effort to protect the native population from the conquistadors.
Yes, so this happened. The church, the crown, and other people tried to protect the Native Americans in the Caribbean, but the fact was that they had no power. Like, it's like that freaking meme. Drop that in there. You have no power here. Lord of the Rings. They had no power. They couldn't enforce that. So it meant nothing. The more real fact of the situation was that economic factors, paying back debt and everything that they had to do, and the fact that the natives in the Caribbean were in such a like pushed down position. They were so downtrodden that they couldn't they weren't able to defend themselves. And then the economic incentive was ripe for them for the people, the Spanish that were actually in the New World, to exploit the people there. So the crown could do nothing, even though they tried. It meant nothing.
One of my favorite eras of history is colonial America, and there's a very clear streak among the British settlers of caring about the natives, and often genuinely like them, even as they fought them. There is no parallel to this in other world cultures. The West's humanitarianism is not normal, and we forget that the rest of the world's never gotten on board. The Russians are invading Ukraine now, the Turks are actively building a new empire while oppressing the Kurds, India is oppressing its Muslims in Kashmir, while most societies in Southeast Asia are committing genocide. China is also committing genocide, colonizing ethnic minority regions, and turning itself into an Orwellian state. The humanitarian streak grew in the West as it became wealthier. There's an interesting book named Fairness and Freedom, which talks about the settlement of both America and New Zealand. The wars against the natives were much bloodier in the US, while the settlement of New Zealand was peaceful. This is since the Enlightenment changed the worldview from natives being heathens without souls to being part of the universal brotherhood of man. As I've said before, the West isn't special for practicing slavery. Most societies have. It is for abolishing it. The West was the only society that felt guilty for its actions and changed, which is something we forget today. We're confused in that we think the world just magically became moral. The moral arc of history doesn't exist. We make it happen. In the 20th century, the Nazis and Soviets practiced the largest slavery and mass death ever. Social justice is trying to drag us back to witch burnings and medieval senses of heresy and clear of good versus evil. In John Gunter's book, where he traveled around 1950s Africa, and he was famous, so he was able to interview all the most important figures in every society, and you would ask these British officials, you put a lot of effort into educating the native peoples, but then the second they become educated, they suddenly become nationalists and start lobbying for independence. And the British officials will say,
okay, I mean, they're being educated by the British who are nationalists. It makes sense that they would become nationalists. Okay, but yeah.
We do it because it's the right thing to do, and whether or not they become nationalists is their private choice as individuals. And that
this was such a great era. Like, this gets looked back on in a lot of mainstream anthropology and everything as being a time of like racism, and it was, you know, but it was also a time of people respecting, although they viewed them as inferior, they still respected the different beliefs of and the different cultures of underlying people in a much more practical and real way than modern liberals do today. And to be honest, these were the progressives of the time. They were racist. Everybody was racist. It was normal. Most of the world is still racist, by the way. They might have a different conception of race, but they're still racist. Whereas, forget what I was going to say. The Europeans, the people who were teaching them things, like while they were racist and they were teaching them things, they were the progressives. They were teaching native peoples, and we view them as right wing today from our modern perspective, not from their perspective at the time. And that brings into question something that I often talk about, which is that like progressives, especially white progressives, who I'm often critical of, they believe that they're correct. They believe that the ways they're thinking are correct, but they're in 50 years, they're going to be viewed the same way that we're viewing, or that they would view these people in the 19th century, these progressives of the 19th century, as racists, and whatever else, whatever other buzzword is of the time.
kind of sense doesn't exist in any other societies, and we need to give the British credit for that. In any other society in history, Gandhi's attempt to shame the British through peaceful non-resistance would have just resulted in him getting hanged by the British government. The fact that that didn't happen suggests a morally much more advanced regime than almost anything else in history. The West did something genuinely great in changing itself for the better and becoming humanitarian. But as other eras of history would have immediately told us, kindness doesn't get you much love in international politics. Countries don't praise the West for this since they're our rivals and they won't love us no matter what we do. That's not how international relations work. Iran and China will always call us the Great Satan no matter how nice we are. The descendants of the people who freed the slaves and peacefully liberated the...
Okay, a lot of that has to do with like mainstream stuff today. And stuff happened in the past that even if America this is why it gets rooted right in like in certain information that is more prominent. But like the US did really screw, and the West in general did really screw with Iran's democratically elected government. And that's not nothing. It's not nothing. So yeah, that's the thing.
Colonies shit on them for not going far enough. Well, they did some of those generous acts in history. Kindness turned to weakness in the West. The language of politics is and will always be power and force, no matter how much we don't want to believe that. We have forgotten that strength is the language of politics. I'll send you all a collective hug at the end of this video, since I think y'all need it. To circle back to the main question of this video, was colonialism good or bad? The short answer is that's not the right metric. Nietzsche talks about how the ancient Greeks had a concept of greatness and weakness that we don't really have today. And with our Abrahamic worldview, we try to shove everything into good or evil. But in the world of politics and power, that's not how things work. In the worldview that the ancient Greeks had, colonialism was clearly great. The Europeans ruled the world for centuries, and their ability to pull that off is absolutely astounding. People will be talking about it for thousands of years from now. However, was it good or bad? And I can't give an answer to that because millions of people were brutally killed, tortured, and so many worse things by European colonizers. At the same time, the Europeans brought many different innovations and were consistently more humane than their competitors. When all said and done, I don't think whether or not colonialism was good or evil is a useful metric, because by the standards of individuals, nations always act like sociopaths.
Okay. Fair enough. I'm gonna hop off here for a little while. You got any questions or anything, hop on the Discord. I'm sorry for whoever literally just joined. But I think I'll be back later, and then 5 till midnight we'll be on at 8 p.m. But I will hopefully be back before then. I might come back and stream again in a moment. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Any questions, go to the Discord. It should be linked down below. It is linked down below.